I set down my glass, placed my napkin across my plate, and walked out of my son's graduation dinner, while 37 people sat in silence watching me go. That was 9 months ago. My son called 6 times that evening. I answered on the 4th call, not because I had calmed down, but because he deserved to hear my voice and know I was all right. I want to tell you something about the kind of man I believed I was for 34 years. I was the kind of man who finished things. Not just projects, not just the work that put money on the table, but the small things, the invisible ones. I was the man who drove 2 hours in a thunderstorm to pick my wife up from her sister's when her car broke down on I-65. I was the man who took 3 days off work when her father had his hip replaced, not because she asked me to, but because I knew she shouldn't have to manage a hospital discharge alone. I was the man who remembered that she liked the heat turned up at night, and I always hated it. And for 34 years, I slept with an extra blanket on my side and never said a word about it. I'm 64 years old. I spent 29 years as a civil engineer, bridges, drainage systems, infrastructure, the kind of work nobody notices until it fails. I retired early from the firm and moved into a consulting role, reviewing project specs, advising younger engineers on problems I had no business still caring as much about as I did. It wasn't wealth in the way people imagine when they say the word, but it was enough. We built a life in a good neighborhood in Nashville. We raised 2 children. We paid for their college without borrowing a dollar. My wife volunteered when she wanted to and rested when she didn't, and I never once made her feel like either of those things was wrong. I say all of this not to make myself sound like a good man. I say it because you need to understand what I thought I was building. 34 years of a structure I had tested under pressure and trusted to hold. I was wrong about nearly all of it. The first sign, I told myself, meant nothing. My wife had always been social in the way I never quite managed. She joined things, committees, church auxiliaries, neighborhood boards. So when she mentioned a pottery class on Wednesday evenings about 2 years before everything came apart, I thought nothing of it. She'd always had interests I didn't share. That was fine. That was normal. Wednesday nights she'd come home sometimes with clay still faint on her wrists, and she'd talk about the other people in the class in the vague, contented way you talk about people you like but don't know well yet. I didn't ask many questions. That's the thing about trust. It doesn't ask many questions. Then the phone changed. For years, her phone had lived on the kitchen counter, left there like car keys, like a thing that had a designated place in the world. Sometime in the spring, before everything fell apart, it started coming to bed with her. I noticed it the first night it happened. I said nothing. I'm an engineer by training, I observe. I don't draw conclusions from a single data point. Then there was a name she stopped saying. She had a woman she'd known from her garden club, someone she'd mentioned at least once a week for years, always with some small story attached. And then, somewhere in the fall, the woman's name simply disappeared from my wife's conversation. I asked once casually while she was putting groceries away. My wife said they'd had a falling out over something she didn't want to get into. I said I was sorry to hear it. I moved on. My son was finishing his surgical residency at Vanderbilt. He'd done his medical degree at Duke, come back to Nashville for the residency so he could be closer to home, which was the kind of thing he always did without making a production of it. He was 33, working the hours that teach you who you are when you're depleted, and he was good at it in the way that people are good at things they were built for. His program held a formal graduation dinner at the end of each residency year, a private dining room downtown, a long table, about 40 guests. Spouses and immediate family were invited. My wife had RSVP'd for both of us months in advance. She organized everything. She always does. She coordinated with my son's girlfriend about flowers, confirmed dietary restrictions with the restaurant, arranged the morning brunch for the day after. She is the social architecture of our family. She decides who goes where and when and in what order, and for 34 years I was grateful to have someone who managed the parts of life I wasn't built for. I arrived at the dinner 15 minutes early. My wife was already there, near the entrance, talking to a man I didn't recognize. She introduced him as someone from her hospital volunteer group, a donor who was in Nashville for a board meeting and happened to be free that evening. He shook my hand with both hands, the way people do when they want you to feel welcomed, and when he let go, he looked at my wife rather than at me. I noticed it. I did not name what I noticed. 6 weeks after that dinner, I was reviewing our joint household credit card statement. I saw a charge I didn't recognize, a hotel downtown. A Tuesday evening in March, $240. I was at my desk when I found it. I sat there for a long time. I am a man who has delivered bad news before. I've stood in front of city planning boards and told elected officials that a bridge needed to come down, that what they had trusted for 30 years was no longer safe. I know what it feels like to say something that changes the room. I sat at that desk and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do with what I was holding. I did not ask my wife about it that evening. I made dinner. We ate. I listened to her talk about a neighbor's new landscaping project, and I said the right things at the right times. And afterward, I washed the dishes and went to bed. The next morning, I called an investigator, a retired sheriff's detective, mid-50s, quiet and professional in the way that people are professional when they've seen everything and stopped being surprised by any of it. He confirmed what I was already beginning to understand within 4 weeks. The man from the volunteer group. He lived in Raleigh, drove over to Nashville roughly twice a month, sometimes more when I had conferences or consulting travel. It had been going on for 16 months. 16 months. I paid the investigator and drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for 30 minutes. The neighbor's sprinklers were running in the late afternoon. The light was cutting through the oak trees at the end of the block the way it does in October in Nashville. Long and golden and indifferent, and everything looked exactly like it always looked, and none of it was what I had believed it to be. I went inside. I kissed my wife on the cheek. I ate the dinner she'd made. The next morning, I called my attorney. Here is what I need you to understand about the months between that October and my son's graduation dinner. I was not numb. People see a man who is quiet and they assume he is shut down, operating on emotional autopilot, getting through each day by feeling as little as possible. I was none of those things. I was precise. 29 years of engineering teaches you that the most dangerous moment in any structure's life is not when you build it, it's when you decide to take it apart. You have to understand every load-bearing element before you remove anything. You have to know what will fall and what will hold, and in what order. I documented. I met with my attorney 3 times. I organized certain financial accounts, all of it legal, all of it transparent, nothing I would be ashamed to show a judge. I made the decisions that needed to be made before a conversation that was going to change everything. And I waited. I waited because my son's graduation was in June, and I was not going to hand him a broken family in the middle of the most important week of his professional life. He had worked 12 years to earn that dinner, that ceremony, that room full of people who were there to recognize what he'd built. What was happening between his mother and me had no place in any of that. That was my choice, and I made it for him. What I did not expect was what my wife decided to do at the dinner itself. The room was a private dining room at a steakhouse off Broadway. Long table, low lighting, 37 guests, the program director, several attending physicians, my son's girlfriend and her parents, a handful of his closest colleagues from the residency. My wife had been in contact with the program coordinator for weeks. She knew the seating arrangement. She had helped confirm it. I arrived early, found my seat. My son was at the far end of the table talking to his chief resident, and he looked the way I had hoped he would look that night. Settled, glad, like a man who had finished something genuinely hard and was only beginning to understand the full weight of what he'd accomplished. Then I saw him. He was near the bar along the side of the room, a glass of something dark in his hand, wearing a charcoal blazer and the comfortable expressions of a man who belongs somewhere. The man from the volunteer group, the man from Raleigh. He was talking to my wife's brother-in-law as if he'd known him for years, as if he were simply part of this gathering, which of course he was, because someone had made sure he was. I stood at my seat and watched my wife cross the room and touch his arm. It was brief, the kind of touch that doesn't require words. Then people sat down. He sat at the head of the table. Not beside my wife, not tucked at the far end where you might explain him away as a late addition, a professional acquaintance filling an empty seat. At the head, the seat that at a graduation dinner for my son, in a room assembled to honor my son, had no business being occupied by anyone except perhaps the program director. Instead, there was this man, jacket folded over the back of the chair, at ease, already belonging. I looked at my wife. She was straightening her silverware. She did not look at me. I looked at my son. He was laughing at something someone across the table had said, and I couldn't tell whether he had noticed or whether he had noticed and didn't yet understand what he was seeing. I picked up my water glass, set it back down. I stood up. The room didn't go quiet immediately. These things happen in stages. One conversation stops, then the one next to it, and then there's a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when something is happening that no one has a script for. My wife looked up. Her face went very still. I buttoned my jacket. I looked at the man at the head of the table. He met my eyes for a moment and then looked away. I looked at my wife for what felt like a long time, though it probably wasn't. I said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said in front of 37 people. She knew exactly what she had done. She had placed him in that chair deliberately. It was a declaration, or a test, or some private statement she had needed to make and had not fully thought through, and it does not matter which one because the result was the same. She knew I would see it, and she put him there anyway. I said, "Excuse me." That was all. I walked the length of that room, and I pushed open the door, and I walked to my car, and I sat there for 3 minutes, watching the valet attendants move between vehicles, and then I drove home. My son called 6 times. I answered on the 4th call. He said, "Dad, where are you? What happened?" I said, "I'm home. I'm all right." He was quiet. Then he said, "What is going on?" I said, "I need you to ask your mother that question, and then I need you to make your own judgment. I'll be at the ceremony tomorrow morning. Nothing changes that." He hung up without saying goodbye, which was not something he ever did, and I understood why. My wife called 19 times. I watched the phone light up on the kitchen counter, on the hall table, on the nightstand after I'd changed out of my jacket and made myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet of a house I had lived in for 21 years. 19 calls. Then a series of messages I won't repeat here. Some were angry, some were explanatory. One of them, around the 14th or 15th, was the message of a woman who had begun to understand that the conversation she had planned to control was not going to take place on her terms. I didn't answer any of it. I slept surprisingly well. In the morning I made coffee, read the paper, drove to the medical school auditorium, and sat in the 3rd row. When they called my son's name and he crossed that stage, I stood up. I stood up and I clapped until my hands ached, and I did not look anywhere else in that room except at him. Afterward, we took photographs on the lawn. My wife was there. We stood on opposite sides of our son and smiled, and I put my arm around his shoulders and meant every second of it. If she was watching me across the space between us, I didn't know it, and I didn't need to. The following morning, there was a small brunch. My son came. His girlfriend came. My wife sat at the end of the table and stirred her coffee and said very little. I talked to my son about his plans, the fellowship he was considering in Boston, whether he wanted to stay in Nashville or go somewhere new, what he thought the next 5 years might look like. We talked like 2 adults who are genuinely glad to be in each other's company, and when it was over, I held on to the hug longer than I usually did, and he let me. The conversation with my wife happened 5 days after the graduation dinner. She came to find me in the study. I was reviewing drawings for a small consulting project, a pedestrian bridge for a county park, something modest. She sat down across from me and started talking before I could say anything. My wife has always moved into difficult conversations at speed, as if momentum can substitute for direction. She said he was a friend. Then she said he was more than that, but it wasn't as serious as it looked. Then she said she had been lonely. She said I was always somewhere else, at the desk, on calls, out at site visits, and that she had needed someone present and that I had not been present in years. I let her finish. When she was done, I said, "I know about the hotel in March. I know about the Wednesday evenings. I know how long it has been going on, and I know who he is and where he lives. I'm not going to argue with you about any of it. What I want you to understand is that I made a decision in October, and I waited until after Miles's graduation to tell you. That was for him, not for you." She went very still in the way a room goes still when the power cuts. "I've already spoken with my attorney," I said. "The paperwork is in order. I'm not asking you to fight me on this, and I hope you won't. We built a real life together, and I intend to end it without destroying what's left." She cried. I had expected that. I handed her the box of tissues from the corner of the desk without getting up, and I waited. I have waited through difficult silences before. After a while, she said, "You knew for 6 months, and you just said nothing. You just went on like everything was normal." I said Miles was finishing his residency. She said, "And the dinner. You just stood up and walked out in front of everyone." I said, "You seated him at the head of the table at my son's graduation dinner. That was not an accident. I don't know exactly what it was. A message, a declaration, something you felt you had to do, but it was deliberate. I declined to respond on your terms." She had nothing to say to that. The divorce took 7 months. We had an attorney on each side and a mediator in the middle, and we divided 34 years of a life with more civility than I might have managed in the first months, and more than perhaps she deserved, but I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it for my son, who loves both his parents, and for my daughter, who lives in Denver and called me every week through the entire process, and who I don't mention enough when I try to account for what kept me level during those months. My daughter called 2 days after the graduation dinner. She had heard the way families always hear things eventually, through the invisible channels that connect people who grew up in the same house. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "Steadier than I thought I'd be, honestly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She shouldn't have done it that way." I said, "No, she shouldn't have." And that was enough. I didn't need more than that, and she knew it. There are things I wish I had done differently. I should have asked different questions earlier. Not about Wednesday evenings, not about hotel charges, but about whether my wife was all right, whether she felt known, whether the life we had built together was still the life she wanted to be living. She said she was lonely, and I don't know how much of that was genuinely true, and how much of it was the story she needed in order to live with what she'd chosen to do. I cannot untangle it, and I have stopped trying. What I know is that I was a man who showed up reliably for the structural crises and was frequently absent for the ordinary days, and I don't get to spend the rest of my life pretending that played no part in any of this. But I also know this: 16 months of sustained deception, coordinating his visits around my travel schedule, learning the rhythms of my professional calendar and working around them, and then that dinner, placing him in that chair at that table in that room on that night. That was not the act of a woman looking for a way out of a painful marriage. That was the act of a woman who had already rewritten the story and expected me to play the part she'd written for me without being told I'd been cast. I didn't. I live in a smaller place now, a condo near the University District, quiet and well-lit, nothing like the house on the cul-de-sac where I spent 21 years. I cook more than I used to, and I've gotten reasonably competent at it. I take evening walks along the river path near Shelby Park, a route I didn't know a year ago, but that I know now, the way you come to know any path you've walked enough times to stop thinking about it. 38 minutes, give or take, depending on whether I stop to watch the water. My son calls on Sundays. He took the fellowship in Boston. He's engaged now to a woman he'd been seeing quietly for almost 2 years before he mentioned her to anyone, which is exactly the thing he would do and exactly the kind of man he is. I like her. She asks good questions and she doesn't fill silence unnecessarily, which is a quality I have come to value more than I once did. I'll be a grandfather sometime next year. My daughter is expecting. I say that out loud to myself sometimes, just to hear how it sounds. It sounds like something that belongs to the future rather than the past. It sounds like it has nothing to do with hotels or Wednesday evenings, or a man in a charcoal blazer sitting in a chair that was never his. It sounds clean. A friend asked me a few months ago whether I regretted the waiting. All those months of knowing and saying nothing. All those dinners eaten across from a woman I had, in some essential way, already left. He asked whether confronting her sooner might have been better. Whether getting the worst of it over earlier would have spared something. I thought about it honestly. The credit card statement in October, the investigator's report, the months of quiet, precise preparation, the ceremony, the dinner, the drive home, the 19 unanswered calls, the 5 days of silence before she came to find me in the study. No, I said, I don't regret any of it. I knew what I was doing and I did it in the right order for the right reasons. My son got his graduation intact. I got the truth on my own terms. That was the best outcome available to me, and I took it. My friend nodded, but I could tell he didn't entirely follow. That's all right. I'm 64 years old. I've learned that certain decisions can only be fully understood by the people who made them. Everyone else sees the outcome. Only you carry the weight of the months that led there, and the particular discipline it takes to hold that weight without letting it show until you are ready, on your own terms, to set it down. I set it down. And I found, when I did, that I was no longer carrying anything that wasn't mine to begin with.